Think about it. If enterprise is economic infrastructure, surely the founder's mindset is intellectual infrastructure in building an organization. And what informs this infrastructure of the founder's mindset? Culture. In today's conversation with Jewel Thompson, we get to ask and explore the question, who gets to define innovation in Africa? I love this topic because there's an element of us thinking of innovation in a purely creative, intellectual capacity, amazing people sense. But there's an infrastructure that informs all of that, that sits in that layer of culture and the way we collectively think of us as a society. Jill came to the Bold New Normal conference in October 2025 and blew us away. And here she is to continue to unpack the lessons that she taught us at the conference. You do not want to miss this, especially if entrepreneurship, innovation, and building those future businesses of the African continent are your thing. Join us. What would it take to really create a prosperous Africa where every African has the opportunity to thrive and not just survive through life? That's what we talk about at the Bold New Normal podcast. We talk to leaders about their areas of endeavor, the work that they're doing to bring the Bold New Normal to life within their sphere of influence, their staying power, and the fact that they serve as an example of what is possible. Join us. Jewel, I have been waiting for today. Welcome to the
Yes.
Bold podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, awesome to have you. You know, before we even dive into me asking you anything, tell us, who is Jewel Thompson?
So, hello. Glad to be back, as I mentioned before. So, Jewel Thompson is a scholar practitioner. So, for me, this is a blend of two worlds that are so important to the language and landscape of entrepreneurship, particularly in Africa. So, from the scholar side, I work obviously in education as a lecturer at a university here in Ghana called Ashesi University. And beyond that, in practice, I've helped ecosystems develop their entrepreneurial networks, their systems, by first starting even with Ashesi, with the Ashesi Venture Incubator, contributing to the design and development of that as a support mechanism for our students, and then moving as far out as working with other spaces within Uganda, Niger, to help them as well in developing their entrepreneurial ecosystems and sharing those lessons learned and that support, that kind of extra layer when it comes to bridging the gap between education, practice, as well as even looking at it from a policy perspective. So I'm building and I'm somewhat of an entrepreneurial architect, if one would say that.
I'm glad you found the word to describe it because entrepreneur, architect, builder, doer, guide, pointing in the right direction, bridging worlds. And bridging worlds comes to mind because even as we speak right now, even though you lecture us at Ashesi University,
Mhm.
you're currently in the US with a group of students, right?
Yes.
What are you doing
Yes.
in the right now? And thank you for breaking your time away to actually have this conversation with me. What are you doing in the US?
Yes, so we have a phenomenal team. It's a mixed, diverse team of engineers as well as business students who've come together to create this really amazing social innovation. So they're actually using coconut husks as a part of their formulation to create an aerosol spray that essentially neutralizes free radicals in the air. So they've attached that to a monitoring system. And within this monitoring system, it allows you to test that air quality to see if you're sitting in a space that has poor air quality, and then it will release the aerosol scent in order to clean. And it has about an 80% efficacy rate when it comes to neutralizing and purifying this air. So they're one of the global finalists for what is the Fowler Global Social Innovation Challenge, which is in San Diego right now. There's about 40 other universities all across the world that are here too with their social innovations. And so we just finished day one of competitions or pitch competitions. And today we will find out if we made it to the top six. I'm hoping so. Please, hopefully I'll come back later with some good news of Team AKI moving on to represent the top six. And they stand a chance to win about $25,000 to $30,000 in moving their innovation forward.
My goodness, I'm so glad I asked about the detail. This is awesome. I love the fact that this innovation is based on something that we produce in abundance because, my number one drink in Ghana is coconut. So if the husk can be
Yes.
used for something else, then, more power to them. This is wonderful. Yes, I wish the team all the very best. I pray that they win, regardless of the outcome. Even above winning the competition, my hope is that their innovation actually gets the support and the funding necessary to really explode. If this is something of such great utility, it should scale up. And that's a conversation for another day. But you are at least the third or fourth person I've touched on this conversation with, and we need to take action. Is how do we create the investment vehicles and funds that will support some of these innovators? Because it's all well and good for me to say I hope and pray that they win and they get. I think we need to take more action to actually fund these innovations to really go beyond startup to scale up and beyond. That's another conversation. I think it's very clear that if we want African innovation to reflect African realities rather than borrowed models, there's certain structural shifts we need to make with educators, investors, founders. And I feel as though it sounds almost as though your intro there was prepped to talk about this, but I think you sit clearly at that intersection of understanding that the role of the educators, the investors, the founders, the commitment of the broader ecosystem. And the way you've described yourself really, really helps us understand why you have come to sit in that space. But again, as I said a few moments ago, what I've come to really appreciate about your work is the contextualization that you bring to it, right? And so we're going to have a great conversation unpacking that. But to start with, given your work and your experience, what belief about entrepreneurship do you think your students hold when they arrive and they arrive to you, you're engaging and you think, I need to challenge this thinking to really get them. Someone has a great idea and you're looking at them, you're thinking, you're a bright kid, you've got a lot to offer, but there's this other piece that I need to challenge or unpack to get you over.
I love that. That's such a great question. So, what I find most times when students come into the classroom, particularly because we have our first year program, a lot of them view entrepreneurship as an escape, right? And I think that's what we've been primed to believe. We'll socially say that entrepreneurship is a way out of unemployment, create your own jobs. We've even seen that highlighted in Ghana, right, by Minister Shan. As soon as you need to create your own jobs, they're not there. That is true. But there can be two things true at the same time. So with that, it's pushing them out of the thought that it's not just about entrepreneurship being this escape from unemployment, this escape, from dependence in some way. But the challenge is that entrepreneurship that has that thought process that's built off of this concept of escape produces very fragile ventures. They're not built to last, right? And what happens now is we need to shift them from thinking of this as an escape, that entrepreneurship is embedded into an identity and we're operating in a particular context. And when we build from there, we move from it being a situation that I'm pursuing entrepreneurship because I'm escaping problems that are inevitable to me or that are around me, but I am now building or utilizing entrepreneurship as a catalyst for exploring like possibility, problems I see every day that I want to fix, that really allow someone to stay rooted, because entrepreneurship is also not easy, right? Even me or you, everyone who does this, it's the realities is it gets tough when you're dealing with customers, everything. So if you don't have that strong foundation that I have a why as to why I'm doing this work and it gets hard, you will abandon it. And then that's where it gets tough. You don't want to become a stronger leader. You don't operationalize well. Tactics are all wrong, and then eventually you quit or you just do business as usual and it doesn't grow in the way that it's intended to. So that's again that challenge of like escapism to really rooting this in, let me build my entrepreneurial identity and understand what this means contextually. And that's what we attempt to do in that first year with them. And it hits a few of them. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one, and I'm gonna challenge you a little bit on that and maybe play
Yeah.
devil's advocate a little bit on, as well. And this now, speaks to some of the cultural context. So I'm a young person. Um, yeah, I don't see any jobs forthcoming. So I think entrepreneurship is my way out. And I hear my, leaders in some forums talking about it and I bought into it. And I'm doing this with positive, good intention. Okay. But then you're challenging me. And my pushback to you then is that, well, as a young person, I'm looking around and I keep being told that Africa has a high percentage of women who are entrepreneurs. So
Yep.
that's another piece of evidence. So I don't know what you're saying, professor, teacher, guy. And then the other I'm challenging you as a young person and saying, well, hang on a minute. Weren't our ancestors or entrepreneurs to start with? Where
Mhm.
have we? So someone's coming to you with this sort of baggage and background and nurture. How do you deal with that? Because while the
I love
points you make are valid and right, this is my sort of lived experience and oral tradition that I have that I'm coming to this with. I'm doing a good thing here.
I love it. I love it, and I love the pushback. And here's where I come back, right? Is the fact that when I say escapism, right, it's not to say that entrepreneurship, when it's bred out of necessity, is wrong. Because you said a key word there that you said, I was inspired and it formed my intention. There is a concept in literature when it comes to entrepreneurship about what are those drivers of entrepreneurial intention that actually lead to action. So again, this is actually the ethos and the core of entrepreneurship. It is that intention. Why are you doing this? Right. And so whether it is a matter of fact that I saw my mother or my father do this, maybe it wasn't into a large scale, but my mom has a small cold store. Right. And I know I can possibly do this. Or the fact that I look around me and I don't see the jobs, but I know that I can sell t-shirts, right, and make some money. That intention is still the driver to say that even when it becomes challenging, I'm going to push through those barriers and look for the tools, the resources, and skills to grow this. However, where the escapism comes back from is that if your intention is not rooted in anything that is more of kind of a long term view of how we're pursuing this venture or the strategy around why I'm doing this work, then what happens is that you see that disconnect because there is no connection. There's no root to this. So you're just like, I'll just go and do this thing, right? It's not rooted in the fact that you're saying contextually, I'm looking at this as a way to transform my life, transform other people's lives, or think about the way I can change my circumstances. It goes back to you grounding. Why are you doing this in the first place?
Mm,
And that kind of is realigned with everything. Why do we do what we do? And so
yeah.
the moment you do something for the pure sake of saying that someone told me to do this, and you have no direct passion or connection to this, you lose it. Right. And when we get too many of those entrepreneurs in that space, that's where we see the fragility in what they're building. And I've come across those students too who are just like, I'm just here to do this. Right. Then they're the ones that are not necessarily coachable. They're the ones that will build something. And, when again, it gets challenging, they abandon it. They are the types of entrepreneurs who really don't try to get creative. They're not innovative in their approaches, their styles, even when they don't have all the resources. And so without that intentionality, connecting them to pushing them toward that pursuit, right, then it won't work. And that's, it's rooted in theory just about our general social psychology, our makeup. So the moment we have someone that's just doing it to pass time, doing it because, hey, it's an option, someone told me to, those are the ones that are very fragile and don't last.
Yeah, there's so much in what you just said. I think I'm going to pick on two things, entrepreneur and mother's cold store.
Mhm.
So I love this example you gave of, mother's cold store because it does represent the sort of entrepreneurship that is very, very common to our lived experience, our cultural context. And
Yes.
whether it's a cold store or I had someone on talking about his father's spare parts business. And these are all very much trading business, right? Do you think there's an element of how we interpret the word entrepreneur within our context, number one? And how then do you think that marries with or jars against the global narrative of startups?
That's good. So I think that in general, the concept of entrepreneur is also somewhat relatively new, right? So this term of entrepreneurship came about in the 17th century. I wouldn't say it's relatively new, but it was a process, and still in our academic literature, it's evolving. What is an entrepreneur and how do you define it? If you go and you look at the source literature, you're going to find probably well over 16 to 20 definitions of what is entrepreneurship. But what exists is the concept of a business person, which essentially did start off in that alignment of trade, bartering. Someone has a resource, you do something for an exchange. So that idea of business and the expectation that you create something, you provide a service or a product, someone purchases it from you and you make money, right? That's the basic concept of that. So I think that in our language of what has evolved now that we have this more like digital enterprise and landscape is that entrepreneurship is all about risk taking, challenges, changes, failing fast, scaling, all of these big, big terms of like risk. ultimately it's super risky, whereby the stability of the business that has been passed down from years to years has been overthrown or overridden by this concept of entrepreneurship. So you see this disconnect where people or parents don't really understand what is this entrepreneurship business, right? We have a business that's stable and you do X and this is how it works. And so this is what we're used to. So this is where the clashes come in, because even still in academia, we're still growing and learning more about this space. I mean, what it means and how that changes and what that looks like in Silicon Valley and what that looks like in Accra Valley, in a sense, right? So there are differences. And I think that the primary difference is that concept of stability, consistency, and understanding exactly what you produce, who the customer is, and how you generate that profit. Whereby with entrepreneurship, it's inherently riddled with a lot of uncertainty.
Yes, you're right. It is a riddle with a lot of uncertainty. So I guess that's why this purpose, this why is so important, because the why gives you a reason to navigate the uncertainty, right?
Mhm.
So I think this, you touched on this Silicon Valley versus Accra Valley. I love that. I'm going to steal Accra Valley. So if we pivot and think a little bit around, systems and sort of broader infrastructure in that context. And again, I ask these questions because you and I both know that culture isn't just the sort of the literal traditions, but
Right.
we have a socio-economic, cultural context, and even where you've unpacked our perception of entrepreneurship. That's very cultural to us. This is how we've
Exactly.
understood it. So how would you say then that culture more broadly has shaped our entrepreneurial intentions in
Mm.
Africa versus how it's shaped those intentions in Western models, whether it's Silicon Valley or more broadly
Right.
in a Western context?
I love that. I think that it's twofold, and it goes back to the theme of last year's conference when we talk about this connection between language and culture. And that's really a heavy driver. So when we look at the perception or intentionality behind, let's say, Silicon Valley for a representation of the global north, a lot of times there's a lot of language that they use that represents their space. So you have to understand, right, your Tam, Sam, and Psalm market sizing. You have to understand customer acquisition. So many terms that are involved with correct or direct measurements of what potential success and growth could look like in your business, which is the language of also investors who are planning to invest in your company. So for us who don't necessarily measure by all of these particular functions, and it's more of this relational knowledge, right? I understand a particular community. I understand how, when they wake up, when they rise, where they like their fish, how they like it cooked, they like this, they like these are the terms we understand to relate to our fellow people to produce for them. Right. So the Wache person on the side in the morning didn't wake up and think about customer acquisition and this is that and the third, right? They thought about really going into what do the people want. And I think that, may she rest in peace, like Auntie Muni, right, who has this phenomenal Wache business. It was one, if you read her story and the case around that, she started off with just rice and stew. But then she realized that as people would come in the morning for the rice and stew, they were bypassing her and going to like the next one. So she was like, "Ah, why is it that no one's coming for this rice and stew?" And for her, she realized, okay, let me go back to something I'm really good at, I specialize in, which is wache. And let me add a little extra flavor inside to this and give them options. So it's wache paired with, a nice drink that you can add to this. And she came up with that system all on her own. So it became a model of saying, let me go back into the skill set that I have and not do what I see on the market, which was again popular as just rice and stew. Let me provide something that I know that this market, as they come by, they ask for every now and then. And I don't have that as a primary dish, but now I'm going to make this a primary dish because it's something I specialize in. And let me package that deal for them, right? Where you can get this watch and you can get this, water and this, of that, third, and move forward. And she did that. And that's what led to her success because she had that consistent recipe that other people really couldn't replicate. And it was just her familiarity, the way that she also created a culture around that environment. And it was just, these are the principles and the language that Silicon Valley and the global north understand, but we haven't translated as such because it's what can I do for my people, my community, right? How do I build for them? What am I creating for them? as the solution. And it doesn't have the same language, but it has the same outcomes. So when we think about that, that becomes our passport, right, into this global dialogue of investors. We have to know the language. But then for us, when they come and they make those investments, or they're in connecting with us, or they're trying to understand why we're approaching a problem a certain way, now it's about moving from this kind of individualistic mythology that grounds a lot of the global north entrepreneurship. And again, that concept of failing fast and doing all of those things, break things, experimentation, but transitioning that to our context and making them, or allowing them, to understand the importance of our relational networks, how we make decisions, how sometimes failure does equate to shame. So it's not always something that is valid, that we can always be excited about experimenting and failing, right? And essentially incorporating that into the design of our businesses a bit more, so that beyond just using the language as the passport into this global conversation, and now we recognize that it's not just our destination, it's not our final destination, it's our access point. So
Mm.
yes, we can learn the language, right, to be a part of the conversation, but it's not the destination, because we also have to let people understand what we're building and why we build the way that we do, right, in order for us to succeed.
Gosh, so much to unpack there. So a few episodes ago, I had a conversation with Cecil, who started eCampus, and effectively
Yeah.
talked about he was he was effectively driven there out of failure. And I say that in
Mhm.
air quotes because that failure became the impetus to his innovation. But it
Right.
was very clear in speaking to him, to the point that you made, and that's why it's triggered that memory for me. It was very clear that he lived with the visceral experience of being a failure, not just
Right.
failing, but being viewed as a failure. So I can see how the risk profile, especially culturally different. When I've dealt with people from, say, North America, the United States in particular, it seems that people are culturally attuned to the, so you failed, so what? Do the next thing,
Exactly.
right? Whereas we can have a conversation, or so you failed, therefore you are a failure. Failing and
Mhm.
being a failure should be two
Two
different
different
things. So
things.
I think this is, you're really bringing that message home in terms of how some of the cultural norms that have informed the language don't always apply to us in the same way. But again, today is about challenge a bit. And I want to
Mhm.
challenge that story a little bit, but before I get
Sure.
there, I want to highlight the fact that, where we've evolved from the last conference, and we took some time out to think about all the amazing conversations we had with people with you, like yourself, is that we're anchoring the boldly normal on our acronym HEART.
Mm.
I really believe it's time for us to tune into healthcare, education, agriculture, real enterprise, and
Right.
trade beyond borders to create our outcomes, our prosperity. And I feel that the conversation with you so far is very clearly, I know we said entrepreneurship and looking at it through a cultural lens, but it
Mhm.
straddles all of these areas, because it's these entrepreneurs who will create real enterprise, and real enterprise that will support all these various areas. So I love the alignment that you're bringing to that conversation. But my challenge to the antimony story is this. It's a great story of how she addressed she knows her market. She
Right.
understood what her clients needed. She built this business. How do we take stories like that and create enterprises at scale that employ people in many locations? So how do we, for instance, think about a Wache business that not mimics a McDonald's model, but is franchised enough so that it's recognized at a certain standard and quality in so many different locations that
Mhm.
multiple people work for the anti-money business, right? So how do
Right.
we transition from that great business to multiplying that great business in ways that create several jobs, so that not everyone has to become their own entrepreneur? They can ride on that sort of, you describe business person, what that entrepreneur has created, to become a business person for part of that business.
I love that, Lucy. And the reason why I'm smiling is because I say the entrepreneur story because we're looking at it from a cultural perspective of like, what are these differences with language, barriers, systems, etc. And this is us in the simple form of entrepreneurship. And as I've been doing my research and talking to others, this has been something that's come up, right? And I recognize it is the fact that when we look at our various cultures, we're going to the north, we're in the east, whatever the case may be, we are still socialized when it comes to the cultural perspective to build for community. So most times we don't build to scale. And that is the thing. And that is the truth, right, of the Antamuni story is the fact that it's not necessarily built for scale. It's built for community. What can I do right here and right now? So I said that story intentionally because this is our mindset. And it's not to say that it's wrong. There's nothing wrong with it per se. But if we're trying to compete globally, if we're trying to figure out how do we make more of this, when we're thinking about replication, when we're thinking about growth, when we're thinking about scale, again, those language worlds that our global north look at to say, is this something worth investing in? This is where we begin to lag. And that is where this concept in the beginning I'm talking about of this architecture or these like myself, social practitioners need to evolve and be a part of these conversations more. What exactly are we building? So when I look at this or a concept like this, I say to myself, when I position myself as this architect, what exactly is the problem? Because when we're thinking about architecture, it's not something that is necessarily built off of templates. It's built off of principles, right? So what are the principles that I'm using as an architect for anyone who calls themselves an ecosystem builder, right? To define exactly what the root of the problem is. So for instance, when I'm thinking about structural structures and systems and how I'm going to recreate something to, again, get to the point of replication of an Antimuni model. If I'm working in an institution like a Shesi, which we have a lot of the resources available to our students, then it's not necessarily about thinking about how to gather all these assets. It's about now I'm going into building something that is more of a mindset shift. How do I transform the way in which my students think, approach, and utilize entrepreneurship, right, as this catalyst for change, a systems change? What am I doing there? But then to the external of that, if I'm coming into a system that's fundamentally broken, so yes, they don't have the resources, they don't have the assets, which is a reflection of a lot of the communities and spaces we enter in outside of Accra, right? With people just building, just trading, just passing, just being an anti-muni in a sense, right? And not to say it's bad. Again, it's not to discourage or disparage what we build, but we're not scaling this up.
Yeah.
Then that's where we come in and start thinking about, all right, what needs to change within this system, right?
Yeah.
And how do I build that foundation? So when we blend these worlds of the global north and the global south, this is important to really sit at the center of this as this scholar practitioner, as this architect. And I just use air quotes because they're just titles. But at the end of the day, of being a doer, excuse me, and a systems builder, we are challenging the thoughts of our entrepreneurs at the moment to say, how are we building this to really make impact? So expanding on that why. Why are you building this? Yes, it's good for the community, but can we open this up, like you rightfully said, to create more jobs? Can we then replicate this model? So yes, Auntie Muni, you may have the best watch, may she rest in peace, right? But how do we
Great,
then make
great.
that
She is let's establish that here.
you're
I
right?
love the way you do it.
So,
Absolutely.
let's make it like Coca-Cola, right? Proprietary information. Nobody knows the recipe allegedly of Coca-Cola, but it survived for over 100 years, right? And this is something that we need to figure out within our cultural context. I don't have all the answers yet. It's something I'm still exploring. And it's what gets me excited about my work is the fact that culture does indeed drive innovation. And there's so many nuances and beauty about what we do that if we can really figure out the blend, the nuances, how we bring this all together, then we can begin to scale and replicate on a level that matches what's happening globally. And we can enter new markets and, to your point, create those enterprises that can cross boundaries, right? And cross bridges. It can cross over or create this more intra-African trade, right? Where we see value. And we can start to see things come about that are different. Because
Yeah.
admittedly, when I go to, art center, every booth that you see is selling the same thing ultimately, right? So how do we then capitalize on the differences in our culture and our design? And that goes back to indigenous
Exactly.
knowledge. What have we left behind that can now
Yeah.
come forth and be compelled to be something different that adds value to the market of goods and services that exist? And
100.
that means that we don't just copy what the West or anyone else does, but we dig deep and get rooted into what is it that we do well, what is that why, how do we anchor in that, what is the system operating around it, and then how do we bring this out to ensure that this system leads to direct impact, where we see that in jobs, we see that in growth economically, we see that in opportunities growing, and we see that in the way in which mindsets are shifted differently to explore the problems around them. right? And not look at it as a problem that is left for the government, but that the everyday person could come around and say, if this doesn't work, like my students right now, if my cousin is having an asthmatic episode, what is the other alternative for making sure her airspace or her air quality is something that is purified? What's the issue here? Right? It's not just something I have to leave for her doctors. I can now think about this. I'm an engineering student, right? And that's what my student is, an engineering student. What can I build in the classroom that's not just something technical? I'm going for it and using that skills and transforming. What is a problem that maybe that doesn't directly affect me, but it affects my person, my closest person? And then how do I go back to the resources that exist here so that I don't have to go and pay for some expensive formulation, but I can figure out a natural formulation with what is here in abundance, and we can grow this at scale. And then this becomes something not only that his cousin needs, but the world needs, but it has this African rendering to it, which is beautiful.
Oh gosh. I mean, unpacking what you've just said, all that you've said right in this section is really speaking, bringing home this
Mhm.
cultural difference. And as you were speaking right there, I thought about, what does this mean for the African investor? Because
Mm,
if like the entrepreneur, if the African investor is only looking for a Silicon Valley model, then they will really struggle to see the justification to put their money into this, if all the metrics you mentioned. So there's that piece, and I'd love to hear your perspective on that. How do we get African money into this entrepreneurs? Because I feel the African investor is more likely to understand the cultural context of
right.
solving for community, and
Mhm.
perhaps support and encourage wherever there's a similar community, you could think of them as your market as well.
Right.
That's number one. But number two is, do you think that part of the cultural context of solving for community undermines our ability to articulate really big ambition around it? And what I mean by that is this. So I was giving a talk recently, and the usual watch it, sorry, not watch it, jollof thing came up, Ghana jollof, Nigeria jollof,
Right.
which is blah blah blah. And I challenged the room and I said, look, it's okay for us to joke in jest about Ghana jollof versus Nigeria jollof. But if jollof is so great, why isn't it a global dish?
Mm. Mm.
Right? So tell us your perspective on how you feel our investors as Africans view our entrepreneurship, right? And how do we challenge that community view? The culture is great, but what if we start to think, how do we start to think of community as not
Mhm.
just what's in front of us? That's
Right.
not just a community that will buy wache here, or the Ghana Jollof debate that is about just us,
Mhm.
whereas we should be leveraging it and creating a global phenomenon.
Right. I love that. I think that it's a powerful one, right? So if we think about most of the global north or the leaders when we talk about innovation and industrialization, this wasn't done in isolation. They were wanderers and travelers. They went to other countries, some, in a good context, sometimes not, but going to other countries and learning the spices that are used, innovations that are happening that they didn't have at the time, that they build upon. Because if we're saying paper was developed here, right? Then they built upon that to create the printing press. So it's so many things of like, you're exploring, you see journals, notes, insights of what other
Sorry,
places,
Drew, can I interrupt you so people get that point? The point you're making is that paper was created in Africa,
right,
right? But the
right,
printing press was created elsewhere. I just wanted to land
exactly,
that piece so that people
right.
understand. People took the paper,
Hmm.
papyrus from Africa, but
Right.
created
The printing
piece.
press going forward,
Yeah.
right? Years later. And this is existing. And then, you see the formations as well in Asia throughout. So all of these different spaces that have their own innovations that others are coming in and learning from, right? And adapting, placing value on them, right? We have gold, we have cocoa, but when we think about value, the extraction of that value is great. But when it's produced here, it's so small. So there's a lot of shifts happening that we don't talk enough about. But I would say that they went out, they learned and came back and applied. Whereby that's the challenge with us remaining very insular and community oriented, is that we stay within the community and we build for that space. However, we don't go out enough to really say, let me understand, extract, and apply and improve upon maybe what I've seen someone else do in this community. Or if I go to, Cape Coast and I see how they do their fishing and their work. Okay, when I come here, I know I don't have as much access maybe to clean, well, now, but cleaner waters in Accra. But what's a method that they're doing that I can do a little bit better based on my context? So that's not really happening. We go back into our comfort, which is again a part of culture, is how do you survive, right? We do what we know and what we're familiar with, and we don't push ourselves enough to take that level of innovation. So to go back to your question around when we're thinking about this new investor or this African investor that understands that, the thing about our African investors is that most of them are in these global conversations. They're in the room. Maybe they've even gone abroad and, like myself, and been educated elsewhere. So if you know how the game, in a sense, or the system operates at a global, what are we coming back home to now say, this is what we need to do? I've gone out and I've learned, I've seen, and now it's time to bring it home and begin to apply and build upon what's existing on the external space or the external grounds. And so this means that we don't necessarily, again, copy what is being done, but we adapt and adjust to what fits our contextual needs. So I think that right now, a lot of our investors, and it's not all of them, because again, they're exposed to this global conversation, this narrative, we then end up playing this or playing the game of volume metrics, right? And that becomes our success indicators. So now you go to an organization or entity, how many ventures have you launched, right? How many pitch competitions have you held? How many graduates from an accelerator have you come through this program? Those become the metrics that we're looking at to define success. But the thing is that when you follow the journey of those founders that have come out through this heavy volume that, again, can work in a developing economy because of just how their systems infrastructure is set up, and you come here and try to assume that you follow those founders in 2 years from now, 3 years from now, they're no longer even in business. It was too much. They graduated, they finished, great, but then they just didn't know what else to do, right? Or the market wasn't built to support or sustain them. So there's this mismatch that ends up happening, and it keeps being our narrative, right? Because they're pushing that these volumes, things have to look like this. So I think that we have to be careful with that and be mindful that it's not necessarily just about the volume, how much, how fast, how quickly, but be mindful of our pace, our network, and really go into the process of saying, hey, we're going to issue patient capital. We're going to grow with this venture because we see the potential here, not only for viability in the African market, but what this looks like when it enters into an Asian market, or if it enters into a South American market, or if it enters into a European market. We're building and we're creating that replication to say that this can work in another space. And we're refining that. We're taking our time, and it doesn't have to be fast like everyone else. It can be a slow process of learning, understanding, adapting, and applying the capital in tranches, right? To make sure that as it comes out is being used the way that it needs to. Because again, excuse me, I'm diverting a little bit, but I remember I had a colleague who was a part of like my Acumen cohort, where she said that with her venture, she was frustrated simply because everywhere she went wanted to require her to ask for 500,000. She needed to have the numbers, the figures, everything. 500,000 is it. That's what we're looking for. $500,000 businesses. She's a Nigerian startup who produces like sanitary pads from banana peels. With that, she was like, I don't need that. I'm running my operations well. I literally just need about 50,000, right? I don't need this big 500. What am I coming to do with that? 50,000 is going to get me to the next level that I need to go, and then I'll move along that way. And I remember when she said that to me, it struck me like, that's really interesting, because again, that becomes the way in which investors are determining kind of their deployment vehicles, that it's 500,000. We're only working with 500,000, 1 million if they've reached this milestone, this benchmark. But then we have, as we've talked about in just previous conversations, this missing middle of capital of entrepreneurs who are at a different level, that if they just had that and used it to get to the next level and the next level, yes, I'll bet a slower pace, they might be able to build things and learn from their mistakes more easily, challenges, and grow and build something to last that doesn't just end after 10 years, 15 years, but we can also have the 100-year business. And that takes a lot. Again, if we go back to just bringing this all together, is when we have the knowledge as educators, as institutions, as investors, as policy advisors from other spaces, we have to also come back down and contextualize that to work within our space, build from there. And then based off of what we've learned, we'll have a destination. We'll arrive at the destination that works for us and allows us to speak to the global market, so that Jollof isn't just something, a West African dialogue and conversation, but now this is something that they look at it as Michelin star rated,
Yes.
thinking about, the tomato that is used and how it does this and the flavor palette, that
Right?
comes up because it's worth that. But at the same
Yeah.
time, what are we doing to really showcase that? I think if we look on the East African side, Ethiopians have done that. Fairly well when you're thinking about their cuisine. You have what Chef Samuel Samuelson, who was that face for some time in New York, right? Bringing those flavors together. And now, even when I used to live in Atlanta, we had, Ethiopian restaurants where people were coming to and loved, and they cherished that cuisine, right? But in West Africa, when we have these really powerful flavor sources, the way in which we build, how are we adapting or redesigning or telling the story? We talked about this at the conference in a
Yeah.
way that people feel connected to, right? Because at
Ex-
the end of the day, all of these things are, regardless, I think if we look global north, global south, let's move all the language out of the way. At the end of the day, we're humans. Humans value connection. Humans value what they can trust, right?
Yes.
And even if they don't understand, if your story frames it in a way that breaks down the understanding, they feel connected or they feel curious. It has to ignite some sort of emotion when you're talking to someone,
Mm.
right? And that is the power in itself of storytelling. But have we told our stories enough? I don't think we have,
No,
right?
and we don't
Yeah.
we I think we shy away a little bit from stories of ambition, forward-looking stories, stories of what's
Yes.
possible. We tell
Yes.
great stories of what has been and where we've come
Mhm.
from, but not the story that says, how that's then you that Amazon press release where they say, even before they create a product, they tell a story of the product
Yes.
and then they go and create that sort of mindset. So you're doing amazing work at Ashesi with these entrepreneurs, really unpacking what it really means to be an entrepreneur and getting them to think about scale and challenging
Mhm.
some of the norms, but also leveraging our context, our focus on entrepreneurship, whether it's to provide for community or just understanding our context. Do you think we're doing enough of that? Do we have enough people in the education space that are helping our young people unpack a very different but relevant approach to entrepreneurship that serves us and our communities and our countries and therefore our continent?
That's beautiful. I'll keep this one simple. We're not doing it enough, but we are awakened to it. So I would plug in a Shesi with our education collaborative. That is a network and a force in which we are using to ensure that African institutions are learning from each other, collaborating, and understanding what works well. And we're looking at those legs from entrepreneurship, employment as well, and ethics. So those are the three pillars we're looking at, is how are we pursuing this new conversation of this new age African leader that all of us in our institutions are developing and are responsible for. And how do we throw away the archaic principles, which sometimes are based in sometimes different education models that, need a shift. And so now it's the point in time where we're saying to ourselves, and we're working together. We have to work together and we have to learn from one another. If someone's getting it right, let's continue to replicate that. We're not doing it enough, but yes, we're awakening, and models like Ashesi University and the Education Collaborative and all the universities that choose to work together are starting to show how effective such a process will be as we begin to move into this next leg together of who is the African entrepreneur, who's the African leader, and what does this look like in the global conversation.
It's hard to talk about who is the African entrepreneur without
Mm.
picking on the emphasis on women and gender
Yeah.
inclusion, because archetypically, especially when we talk about the entrepreneur who trades, we tend to think about the African woman very, very quickly.
Right.
How included are African women truly in entrepreneurship, like real entrepreneurship that goes beyond survival and hustle and the trade for subsistence? How included are African women in real innovative entrepreneurship?
It's not there. I think that that's also a conversation. I mean, I know there's a lot of pushback on, this separation when it comes to the gender politics of it all, but the reality is we're facing some cultural resistance, right? Because a lot of women are socialized to simply, and again, it's still to this day, it's not something that has changed. It would be a different conversation that had changed, but you are socialized to see value of being the mother, the wife, in the home, working, that is your pride when you show up and you have that conversation. And it's not to take away from that. I think that is definitely important as women, that we pride ourselves on being this center for our children, for our family, for our husbands, whatever the case may be. We are the center, we are the source in the sense of that love. But At the same time, it also is about partnership, collaboration, building equity in what we're doing as well. That's not just who we are, it's a part of who we are. So men get an opportunity in these conversations to be in part, be a little bit of everything, right? And still get the hat tip like, yes, sir, yes, boss, chairman, right? All of those things. But for
Shit.
women, that's what happens just by the sheer grace of being a man, but as a woman, you have to fight harder for that because you enter into spaces and sometimes the psychology of how you're dressed, what you look like, what's your background, all of those things become the immediate caricature of who you are and your capabilities. Even before you open your mouth and say, this is what I do, people are already questioning just by what you may look like or how you present. Are you capable? Right. And I'll take a quick story, an example. Another one of my colleagues, she mentioned she had walked into an investor room and at the table, she was pitching her concept, talking through this. And they're like, oh, this is great. Where's this, like the founder, your co-founder, the guy, where's the man? And this happened maybe just 4 years ago. They questioned her on where was the man. I know you have a male co-founder or something. And she was like, no, this is me. I'm the founder. I came up like, this is my product. And it was just, she was just taken aback. Like, I can't believe that actually happened. And this, we're not talking about 1950 something. We're talking about 2021, right? When this happened and it occurred in a room with investors and conversations that were being had. And I was just on a call with one of who will become one of my partners for our that I have. And she was telling me how what was interesting is that in order for her to get to, and she's a Nigerian, to get to the success that she had gotten to, she actually had male mentors. And the male mentors gave her a certain level of language and bravado that she needed to bring to the room to be respected, right? And what she would need to push back. Because again, those are those little cultural nuances that exist in us, that there is the demureness, the quietness. Don't be bold, right? Too audacious. Don't be too much as a woman because they won't take you serious. So, to cut this in short is the fact that no, we're in a situation or a system right now when, again, there are still, no matter with women accounting for about 98% of small and growing businesses within the continent, they still aren't at the tables or respected in the ways that they could and should be. Right. Their equity is not there yet. And it's something all of us have to work on because it doesn't just come from the male side. We as women as well hold that too. So some of those internal biases exist for us too. And we can come into a room and meet another woman and have that same reaction like, oh, this is the leader. This is the person that's coming to teach me or tell me something. And all of that has to be dismantled and dispelled where we have this equitable conversation at the head and really judge or establish credibility based off of what the person has been able to produce, what they're saying, and not just based off of the auspice of what their gender identity is, you know. And so for me, that's really important. But we still have a lot of work to do there, still a lot to build because it's not just in, West Africa, it's across Africa because some situations are still very severe, right? Where there are some women who still have to get approval from their husbands or their father to purchase land or make financial decisions. And that again is in 2026. That's not a 1950 figure where people are still dealing with that in business. So what can we change? What can we shift? And I think a lot of organizations are now waking up and trying to move towards that.
I suspect, the answer to my next question, I think you've already given. I just want to still ask you this question very directly because the more you spoke, the more I thought, is this the real solution? Is policy
Mm,
enough? Is
mm,
policy
mm,
change enough to create that equity that you mentioned? Is it enough? Can we
mhm,
solve getting more women included and
mm.
creating that equity that they need? Because that tends to be what we talk about. We talk
Right.
about how we need this bill passed and we need that done and we need that policy passed. And I'm thinking, well, if I'm listening to you correctly and learning from you, how can that solve it?
It's such a good question. And in my humble opinion, without being an economist, so I hope they don't come from me in this, but coming from my perspective and my lens, I don't believe that policy is enough, right? The reason why I say that is if it's policy reform that ignores essentially cultural systems, right? What happens is that it can actively or progressively make things worse, right? Because it's creating an infrastructure that nobody will essentially use as intended. And that becomes a problem. So if we look at it from the perspective of policy being the architecture, then culture is essentially our gravity, right? It is our force. It is a thing that will need to be understood, adaptive
I love
for. We need to make sure that they are blended and working hand in hand, not in isolation, which sometimes it
yeah.
happens, right? Because most times you see people building the most elegant infrastructures and the supports, the policy documents, the briefing comes on, but they didn't account for all of the forces that are also acting on the potential design of this policy infrastructure that won't necessarily stand or last, right? And this is where we get these tensions that we see now with the amazing trade agreements, things that come up, AFTA as an example. Not to say that anything is wrong, but it's been there with this beautifully written language and great intention, right? But ultimately, it is something where we move beyond just saying it's all regulatory, et cetera. It is relational. Are we looking at it to where we're not looking at all of our African regions as homogeneous, that we're looking at them from the perspective of it's questioning what are the different cultures, clashes, the frictions that are influencing the way in which people actually relate to one another, do business, or are willing to do business with one another. Have we accounted for that in our architecture and our design? Or is this again treating everyone very much the same?
Yeah.
Influences, desires are all the same. And that's where we struggle with right now, in my humble opinion. Again, not being an economist, but looking at it from, my own
But
lens.
just for the
I had
benefit,
to put the disclaimer there, but someone comes from me.
when this comes, we'll just have to interview them on the Boldly Normal conference. I keep saying conference, normal podcast to get their
Right.
perspective. But just for
Mhm.
the benefit of those who may not know, AFTA is the African Continental Trade Agreement, right?
Right.
Just so those, that was your response on policy. But what you've described there then leads me to then ask you again, are we saying that sometimes there's a clash between the theory that lands in the sort of the policy document and the
Yeah.
reality of the lived experience?
Absolutely. I do agree with that, right? And I mean, that is the tension in general with academia. You'll have people come up with theories and then immediately you read it, you review it, and you're critiquing it, saying it's lacking this, it's not considering X. And so you'll have someone produce a response paper critiquing exactly what has come out. So if even in academia, we're seeing these tensions that someone can build this theory based off of evidence of practice that have come from the field, their insights, the rigor of the work or testing that they've done, it means that there's the potential at the same time. Have we stress tested some of these policies that are so imbibed in some level of theory? Have they been pressure tested to adapt for the context that is the real reality of the lived experience? What is really happening? Where are you getting this insight from? And do you have the evidence to support that this will indeed work? That is also entrepreneurship in a sense, is that experimentation with evidence, right? And that's what is required of any good business. Do you have the evidence that there's a market, validation, product market fit, right? That this is going to work. And in the event that it doesn't, is there a plan or a pivot, right? When it comes to that level of failure, is there another direction that we can swing to that allows us to quickly learn from this lesson? And that's the difference, is that it's not the same when it comes to policy. It takes so much time, but there's not that back end kind of support strategy to say, all right, if this doesn't work, what is our pivot? What is the backup? What does this look like? And what are we going to be testing for to ensure that this may move forward? So it's that level, how do I put it, is the fact that policy is rather structured, right? As opposed to it being something that's malleable, right?
Mm,
And so that is important in the African context. And I think bringing all of our big minds together is looking at that with a fine tooth comb. And again, making sure that we're not producing these things for volume metrics, that we have it just to say we have it. We've produced it and said we've produced it. But have we actually
yeah,
stress tested this thing and actually ensured that it works for our people in our context based off of the cultural nuances that exist or the intercultural nuances that exist across the varying cultures and regions across Africa? Because even
yeah,
already in Ghana, we have 16 regions, 16 different types of background experiences, and the way people trust, relate, and connect is very different. So if we're coming up with these
yeah.
agreements, are we looking at it just from a national level or are exploring and going deeper and saying this accounts for the differences in our regions? And have we found a commonality? Has anyone done that level of testing? It may take a lot of work. It may take some time. But I think that, again, from an African perspective, we have to keep that in mind because that is exactly what the global north does, right? When it comes to statistics, analysis, data, they're constantly collecting information about the well-being and the economy of their people. They're doing
Yeah.
that. And they're evolving and adapting according to what they're seeing from those insights. I don't think we do
Uh,
enough of that.
Gosh, honestly, this conversation, I enjoy listening and learning from you so much. We could go on and on and on. So
Yeah,
please bear with me. I have a few more questions. But
sure.
from that point that you've made, recognizing the context and the amount of investment you've made in clearly understanding what it takes. And I know you're very humble and polite in saying you're still learning, but even on this journey that you're on, how much of this, if you had to talk about a split, 100% split between how
Mm,
much you're having to build and taking a bit of an outside in view
mhm.
versus how much you're being able to leverage what exists, right? Because sometimes we can take a system and amplify it and grow it, but sometimes we have to fundamentally to change the system and rebuild it or build it or create it
Mhm.
if it doesn't exist. How much of your approach to really bringing this, maturing this entrepreneurship, really important, necessary vehicle and infrastructure of our economic growth? How much of your time or your effort is in building a new or rebuilding or versus leveraging the system that exists?
That's a great question. So I would say, in all honesty, I've been back home in Ghana now for about 7 years, and I would say my first 2 to 3 years, I would say when I look at the split, it was more of like a 70-30, where I was building or creating with what I knew from the outside coming in, and not necessarily leveraging on what existed. And I quickly came to learn that it didn't work that way. It wasn't the best approach. It helped when it came to just thinking about how to structure things, how to design things. But in practice and implementation, there were failures. And so I had to pause and actually begin asking questions. Like now, every time I do a session, every time I'm learning, like I said, learning from students, I'm talking to them, right? How does this land for you? How do you feel? Just even now with my students that I'm here coaching for the competition, we had just a really in-depth conversation about what really prompted you to pursue entrepreneurship, right? What are you doing? Why is this here? And one mentioned how for them it was more of an escape, right? Going back to the escape, but the escape was saying, I don't want to live in financial struggle anymore. So I'm going to pursue something that allows me to bring this to my family. And for the other, it was modeling. I saw my mom do it, saw my dad do it, my brothers. And for me, it shows me that excellence is possible and I want to pursue it in this capacity, right? And so with these two variances show up, but then the common line, which was interesting, we don't talk about, and we don't have to go into too deeply just yet, because that's a whole nother conversation. It's actually religion, faith, right? So for them, both of them, those were huge drivers. If God says I can do it, or if give me the tools and the strength, I'm going to do this. I'm going to pursue this wholeheartedly. And so we oftentimes, even in entrepreneurship, don't have those discussions about faith and the journeying of that. I think, again, from the global north perspective, for those who aren't on the faith continuum of a sense, it becomes an individualized perspective. I can do this. I know I can. If I think I can do this. But here, from a cultural perspective, with the strength of God, I can do this. And that's another powerful indicator we don't usually measure. So that becomes very different. So when you're designing a program or designing anything, are you taking into account some of these drivers, things that change intention? That's not always just based on risk calculations, but is really based on the fact that it could be familial, it could be a religious driver that's in the back end. And how do we then incorporate that into a uniquely designed tool or instrument that amplifies their ability to do this better and have more strength, confidence, boldness in pursuing this, right? And breaking previous, maybe negative mindsets that have hindered them to develop something strong. So that has now been my approach. And I would say I'm shifting that to where it's still, I'm hoping to get closer and closer to hopefully a 50-50 balance, because I still think the external lens is important in shaping this, and I won't negate that. But at the end of the day, I need to bring in more of the insights, the things that I don't know that we do well that I can leverage to improve. So I'd say I'm moving towards 50-50, but started more with the 70-30, which didn't work. And it forced me to evaluate what I'm building, how I'm building it, and who I'm talking to. What do I understand about what already exists that can make this better?
I just love your openness to the idea that you could start at a certain position, acquire new information, and be open to the fact that you need to shift your position and your approach, which tells me that as a leader in this space, you're probably not coming at it as a have my view and this is how you're going to do it and it's command and control and I'm the boss of this and do you know how
Yeah.
many entrepreneurs I've supported, you must do it this way.
Right.
And the faith and religion point is really important because fundamentally we are a faith-led society
Yeah.
more broadly. Now, people express their faith in different ways, but we are a faith-led society. So double clicking on your response there, as a leader, do you think you've had to change? some beliefs that used to hold dear. So you've talked about shifting your approach. Has that
Mhm.
shift in approach influenced any change in belief or perspective that you had before?
Let me think. I would say yes. I would say the changes for me from a leader perspective, and I think this is a common one for most people, is that I also learned that I may carry expertise because I've dived into the work, I've done the research, but I'm not fully the expert, right? Because I don't know the experience of a young entrepreneur in Tamale and what they're going through. And it wasn't until I went to Tamale and had an experience with the women entrepreneurs there that I started to learn that, again, even there, they have to get approval from their husbands to get access to land. Because we had bankers in the room and we were talking about this in a financial conversation, and one raised their hand, like, I'm dealing with this issue. And for me, again, this is 2022. Like, this is still happening. Interesting. So how can I come here and propose all of these great ideas when at the basis of this woman's experience is the fact that she needs to get permission? Then it becomes a shift of, all right, well, if that has to happen and we don't have to say we're changing the whole system, then now you need to design something that the husband understands the importance of the wife being able to do XYZ. So then how do we revise that system, right? Slightly so that it's adaptable and changeable in a way that, the husband still feels the way that he wants to feel, the big man, but he doesn't realize that he's a part of this transformation, right? It becomes a new way. That becomes innovation. How do we innovate with existing cultural systems that perhaps we can't change in a day or a month or a year? It'll take time, but there's simple things, simple changes, tweaks that you can do. And so for me as a leader, I was recognizing that, again, I may carry the expertise, but I'm not fully the expert. I'm still learning from the experiences that of the people that I engage with and that I connect to, and that everything isn't prescriptive for me, right? Everything can be adapted, but at the root of it, I won't change my root of the this particular transformational process, right? Is the fact that it has to be rooted in evidence. I have to test it, and I have to have this tested against multiple examples, right, to say that this is indeed the truth. So everything for me, while I'm malleable, I'm adaptable, it's rooted in evidence. And until I have the evidence, I cannot hold that as my truth. So I'm anchored in that, right, to say that I may see this, I may understand it, but how do I ensure that this, from an evidence perspective, is something I'm seeing to be true? So that for me realizes it takes more time, right? Yes, 7 years seems like a long time of being in Ghana and learning, but my adoption process, everything, probably it won't get to that point where I can come back to you, Lucy, and be like, I have written the book, I've done this. It'll probably take me another, 2 to 3 years, maybe. I'm getting to the 10-year mark, right? When I'm at 10 years, then I probably have enough information. That's just for me. That's probably for someone else in a different field, in a different capacity. It could be quicker. It's a different process altogether. But for something as important as entrepreneurship and how that is evolving our ecosystem, because it sits at the center of everything that we do. And with me now exploring this cultural component to it, which has been underexplored, talked about, but not explored in the capacity of like looking at it from international perspectives, right? How do we go beyond just the nation level of understanding of culture, but go deeper into what this looks like regionally? Bringing that to light is going to be very important. And that's what my work is doing now and exploring. And my hope is that, again, I'll be able to come out with that methodology that can support and is designed in a way that is adaptable, right? Reframable, contextualized, that can be applied in different spaces. And then also has the breaks to where this cannot be applied, right? Because we also need those conversations because not everything needs to be adapted. But in this space, it might be so unique or so homogenized that it doesn't need whatever my solution may be. So I'm still growing, still learning, carrying my expertise, but recognizing I'm not the expert.
Well, I have one more question and then your last word. So that's effectively
Hey.
two questions. But here's the thing. I hope you recognize how unusual you are, not just in the space that you occupy, but the person you are in that space. And if you don't hear it enough, I just wanted to say that to you because being unusual is a compliment, but laced in that word unusual is challenge, right? Because anytime
Mhm.
someone's unusual, stands out for being different, it means a lot of the time that they're walking a path that's uncommon. They're trying to
Yeah.
do something that hasn't been done at scale, so it's not the norm. The fact that you focus on entrepreneurship, but deeply, deeply recognize and respect the cultural context and help us unpack that is something that I'm sure that I will continue to talk to you about and learn from, because in all of my years of sort of, again, thinking of transformative leadership, it's the one thing that I've deeply recognized, that because in all aspects of our life, we keep comparing to societies that have completely different cultures. We miss the mark of what is really applicable to us, right?
Yeah.
And one really good example I love to give people is when I studied economics, I only studied it as part of my MBA. So enough economics to be dangerous, but not enough to be um, one of the things that struck me was when they talked about supply and demand, I'd sit in this class and I'd go, this will never work in Makola.
Mm.
Right. And I'd look and they talk about, even just the information asymmetry, the cultural positioning of an Makola woman, and it just wouldn't work. Right.
Yeah.
And then I didn't have the language for it. But when I listened to people like yourselves, I realized that what I was saying is that the supply curve and that supply and demand relationship has a certain cultural context in which it was created. My context in Ghana doesn't speak to that because the systems are different. So then
Different.
that leads me to my last but one question for you is, what drives you? You're clearly passionate about what you do. What is the
Mhm.
driver that keeps that passion alive?
It'll sound cheesy, but it's a general natural curiosity. Why are things the way that they are? And why are we the way that we are? When I was younger, I thought like maybe I'll go into something like social related, right? Thinking about just really trying to understand the root of people because I was inspired, sometimes incised or angered by history and what happened, the good and the bad of history. And gleaning in on the good, I wanted to know why, even for, when I'm thinking about individuals when they become leaders, when they're special, I'm like, why? And I think like Malcolm Gladwell created the book, like, or wrote the book on like outliers, right? And books like that, things like that, I'm like, oh, someone thinks like me. Like, I want to know why. What is this thing that makes someone excellent? What is the thing that, helps us think about why we do what we do? And it drives me. And then I look at the lens of myself almost as my own study, my own case study of looking at myself. Why am I doing this? Why am I taking on this decision? And then I'm even fascinated by the moves that I make or the decisions that I make. I mean, it becomes crazy in a sense, right? But I just value that driver of understanding why. And I think not enough people, and maybe it's not that's not their purpose, ask enough of the why. Right? Why is this happening? We are more reactive, right, than pensive about why did this happen this way? How can we change something slightly? Or why does this continue to perpetuate? What's driving it? So when I
Mm,
think about it, when I was younger and living in the States and not far removed from my Ghanaian culture as one may think, I would come home. It was weird. And my mom jokes about this. I would come home and be like, does no one see what I see? Like, this is like back in the day. I'm like, we have everything. What is happening? Like if anyone else came here, they would just turn this place around. Like it would be so phenomenal. And I remember that because I saw like a goat randomly walking in the street and I'm like, where is his pasture? Why isn't he or she contained? Right. And why isn't someone making money from this goat milk and this, like everyone, you go into Whole Foods, you see goat this, da, 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 da. So many things that have happened when I'm comparing and contrasting my experiences to just being in the States and then coming home and seeing like my eyes are like opportunity, opportunity, things, things, things. But then it hit me like, what is it? Right? It has to be something. And I don't know what that thing is. I don't have the answers. And that's what forced me to come back and explore that. So yes, and long and short of it, curiosity, the why of it all. Why do we do what we do? And it's okay if I don't ever get the answer, but I want the pieces, the evidences of what and how that contains the why so that it's easier for us to build. Because I'm also encouraged by challenge, like you said, things that don't make sense. I'm like, I want to figure it out why this is happening, and hopefully I can put this puzzle piece together. And if I can't, create the foundation that someone else can build off of and continue the work. Because again, historically, if you see that again from the nations that have been built, it has been just learning after learning, building upon someone else's theory, someone else's concept. When we're thinking about wealth creation, is that historical information and insight that guides us in getting to that point of success. So That's it.
Awesome. So, Jewel, oh gosh, I've had such an awesome time. The last word I'm going to give to you, because this is your session. And when we talk about real enterprise at the bold new normal, we're anticipating the scaling up of as many enterprises, entrepreneurs that you're working with. We look forward to them being scaled businesses that create jobs across the continent. So, in your last word, give us a vision to hold on to. Where are we going with all of this? 10 years from now, what would you love to see about enterprise across the African continent? We'll hold on to that.
That's a powerful one. Let me think thoughtfully about that.
Yeah,
I would
that's
say
great.
that African innovation is not behind. It's just been mismeasured, right? And so it is important for us to begin to think about the structural shifts that are required for us for this to be an investment into a model that is emerging, right? And we need the courage to begin to build a new system that we haven't seen before. And I think for me, that's really important when we're thinking about the next level of enterprises.
Awesome. We've got to think of ourselves as builders and building the systems and the infrastructure that we need and
Yeah.
do all that in a cultural context. Jewel, thank you so much for taking the time to really
Yeah.
unpack a really important subject with us. And like I said, I'm a student of your work, so we will definitely talk again. But
Thank you too. This
thank
was
you.
great. This was fun. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you for tuning in to The Bold New Normal. I hope this episode has inspired you to think boldly and take action towards creating the future you envision. If you found value in today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs a dose of boldness today. Until next time, take action, create your bold new normal.